Mediation for Dummies. Have we found, finally, a way to replace lawyers? Given today's topic and the guest dealing with the art, and it is an art, of mediation, should become required listening for anyone who has yearned for an alternative to the ever-present world of lawsuits and countersuits and the years of time and money sucked up by barristers in courtrooms. Now, we're not only talking about the weariness of the court system here. Properly understood and practiced, mediation has historically brought about not only peaceful settlements in all sorts of disputes, but in many cases healed relationships as well. Not something that can be easily said of the legal industry. But if it's so good, why isn't it being used more? So we're going to pose that question and more to our telephone guest today, Victoria, aka Vicky Pynchon, who is a well-known and respected expert and practitioner of alternative dispute resolution. She's a keynote speaker, a consultant for her company, She Negotiates, in Southern California, and most recently the author of the book, Mediation for Dummies. Now, considering that 15 Minutes of Fact is largely focused on the Occupy movement, a question you might logically ask me is, just what does this guest and the tools of mediation have to do with forwarding the purposes of Occupy? Simply everything. And we're going to confirm that by asking that question of Victoria, where we find her at her home in Los Angeles. Welcome to the show today, Vicki.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm glad we finally have the chance to get together and talk.
It really is good. Having met you in New York City several months ago, we were both at a ADR conference and listening to some wonderful speakers. I just had the good fortune of sitting next to you, and having recognized you from your blogs and the writings that you do on Forbes, I was honored to make that connection, which is why you're here today. So let me ask you the first question. What does mediation and what do mediators have to offer to Occupy?
Well, mediation is simply the consensual resolution of disputes with using a third-party neutral or a third-party professional who's skilled in facilitating communication between and among parties who are locked in conflict. And the Occupy movement is non-hierarchical, and as is mediation. It works by consensus, as does mediation. It doesn't require, nor does it want, any judges or politicians or governors or presidents telling them what to do. They're both pretty much you are not the boss of me movements.
That certainly sounds like the Occupy leaderless and leaderful movement. But actually coming from someone who has received a Juris Doctorate from UC Davis, where you graduated with honors. You also earned a Master of Laws degree from Pepperdine. Aren't you somewhat of a turncoat in that industry?
Actually, I see myself as a helper. I believe that, somebody had me read Hero with 1,000 Faces when I was in high school. And, it would be immodest of me to cast myself in the role of a hero. But, all heroes' journeys start by simply stumbling over something, upsetting the apple cart, and that stumble always opens up a new world. And I stumbled over mediation very late in my legal career. And let me say that when I began my legal career, I was coming out of a childhood in which I saw the courts deliver civil rights to people who had been made second-class citizens for centuries in this country. And the law seemed a very good way at the time to participate in and move social change. That's what moved me into the law. I have to tell you that I did not stay in social change.
Well, how did that come about?
How did
the fact that you moved from a primarily legal structure, even though it was a helpful legal. In other words, we have so much debt to owe to the attorneys and the lawyers and the system that helped people get their just and rightful place in society. And then there's the dark side where lawyers and the system seem to militate against anybody getting a fair shake. So how did you approach that, and how did mediation become important to you in that world?
Well, as I said, I didn't discover mediation for a couple of decades. So I started my career as a plaintiff's personal injury attorney, representing people who had sustained injuries when doctors malpracticed, when products malfunctioned, when obstacles were put in the way of people with disabilities. And that's a contingency system. For anyone who doesn't know that, it simply means that plaintiffs' attorneys don't charge by the hour because most of their clients can't afford it. They represent their clients on a contingency. They take anywhere from a third to 40% of the award or the settlement as their fee. So that seemed like pursuing social justice, and I very much believed in it. But you know, I'm not a gambler, and I was not happy working on a contingency. I'm very curious intellectually, and I wanted to work on sophisticated, interesting, complex cases, and I just sold out, baby.
Well, I see that actually as the sign of an inquiring mind, of somebody who wants to analyze and fix things rather than simply have a single purpose of getting the win. So how is that different in the Occupy world? Well, not the Occupy world, but in the mediation world.
Okay, so let's just fast forward through 25 years of me serving corporate interests and move into me stumbling over mediation, having the skies torn open and angels descending, telling me this was finally the right place for me to be, that this was a place where people mattered, that this was a place where I could use my people skills. This was a place where people were self-determined, where people determined their own futures, and their futures were not determined by a system that continues to be run by, with all due respect, old white men. So I returned to I learned what I needed to learn about facilitating communication between and among warring parties. I studied the social psychology of conflict because I've always been interested in why people do the crazy things they do. And I moved back into the legal domain that I had spent my career in an attempt to bring what I thought was fire from the gods back to the attorneys who I knew were suffering doing what they were doing.
And how were you received?
I'm received well when people actually use me, but in the world that I worked in is about 85-90% male and white. And they don't really understand mediation. They still think that a mediator's job is to overpower the will of the other side. And they don't think a chick can do it.
Got it. You know, I find
use the word chick.
You know, I find it interesting in my experience with Occupy is that some of the most dynamic people I've met, and the ones who are anti-authoritarian, especially the ones that dismiss them, are women, are people who are just sick and tired of being dictated to, being relegated to second place, and having the law very carefully manipulated to trample their rights. So I see a lot of parallels between the needs of Occupy to express itself and succeed and the women's movement in general.
Yes, so do I. And I really am a lifelong activist in my heart, but I have only implemented my activism for these discrete periods in my life. But Well, let me say this, not in my defense, but by way of explaining how I believe that I can be valuable. I occupied the upper reaches of the legal system inside the Fortune 500 corporate culture for 25 years. And most of that was sort of stealthy. I serve my clients wholeheartedly because I want to win. That's a lawyer's blessing and a lawyer's curse. But I get them. I understand them. I know what motivates them. I know what they do bad, and I know what they do good. I know what they're capable of doing good. For instance, I think corporations led the way in domestic partner benefits and in paving the path for people to even consider homosexuals being legally married under the sanction of the state. Corporations were ahead of the political system in that regard, and they were because they needed these people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's it. I would like to imagine that politicians might listen to people because they need their votes, but the reality is they need money for campaigning more than they need to actually respond to the people that vote them into office. But if we took a look at the work that you do and the fact that Occupy came to your attention, I know in doing a bit of research, sort of like a bonus question for you, but in the fall of 2011, when Occupy was really beginning to gain national attention in Zuccotti Park, you moderated a panel with feminist leaders like Gloria Steinem, Gloria Feldt, Shelby Knox, and others at a South Carolina Women's Lawyers Association conference. Now, considering that you were a full-time activist in the second wave women's movement in the early 70s, it's almost as if you're coming full circle. So tell me about how this intersection of Occupy and women's rights and mediation seem to be coming together for you.
You know, Joseph Campbell in an interview with Bill Moyers talked about Schopenhauer's observation that if we look back at our lives, it's as if there were a single composer composing all of its threads, so that in the end it seems to have worked in a symphonic manner to produce a kind of result or a path forward that in which all the parts come together. And Campbell said that's simply the will to life. And it is the expression of the life of an individual. And so I would say coming full circle is the expression of who I truly am. Listen, it takes a long time to grow up. It takes a long time to rid yourself of, I know this is personal, but the personal is political. It takes a long time to rid yourself of the things that impede your spiritual progress.
This is a conversation I can imagine I would have a difficult time having with someone with strictly a traditional legal background. Whereas in my experience in mediation, it seems that, I could be right or I could be wrong, it seems that there's a higher overall purpose or structure in which people engage a mediator, knowing that the mediator is going to try to get the best practical resolution possible. And to talk and to address things spiritual would almost be a necessary part of that, as opposed to a traditional lawsuit.
It's interesting that you say that, because I was mediating a trade dress case this week. And a trade dress case is like trademark, except, it was over the shape of the water container for okay. This is why I love mediating in Los Angeles. So the people in one of the rooms were an Indian lawyer, a Moroccan businessman and me. And we were talking about, what made sense to do, what made practical sense to do. And the businessman looked at me and he said, "Do you believe in God?" And I've been mediating for 6 years. No one has ever asked me this question. And I paused for a fairly lengthy period of time. And I finally said, "That's a very personal question. Why do you ask it?" And then we started talking about fate and human will and self-determination. And he said, I'm a Muslim. And the Indian attorney said, "I'm a Hindu." And that sounds like karma to me. And I said, "Well, I was raised a Christian." So we've got 3 out of the 4 world's great religions in the room, grappling with the problems that men and women have been grappling with from the beginning of time about, the difference between, the role that fate and free will plays in our destiny. So yes, mediating reminds me of being on a rafting trip in the middle of the Grand Canyon, where everybody sits around and questions, what in the world are they doing in the business world? What's their purpose? Because you're out in nature. These are the questions that occur to you when you have 5 minutes to give a thought to something deeper than where you're going to make your next $25.
Well, there's another aspect of that rafting analogy. Once you get on the river and you get into the white water, it's amazing how differences drop, because the purpose is to survive and to reach an outcome successfully. And I believe that the environment that's created by the mediator certainly makes that possible.
Yes, I do consider myself a river guide in the mediation room. And what the river guides taught me to do was to paddle through my fear.
Well, let's talk about being a river guide for Occupy. Given the fact that Occupy is as close to an anarchic political movement as we've seen in the past 50 years, is the fact that there's a lack of designated or assumed leaders in this non-hierarchical structure and culture. Does that pose a problem for a mediator who's trying to work with the movement?
No. Do you want to hear the story again that we heard together in New York of the young women who mediated a dispute with the drummers in Zuccotti Park?
Yes, and I want to make that, give some background to the audience, to our listeners. Zuccotti Park was an interesting place, less than an acre. There was a west end, there was an east end. The west end was populated by rather colorful people and what was called the drummers. These were people that liked to drum and create a lot of noise and sound, while at the east end of the park, it was mostly the library and the intellectuals, if I could call them that. So in this odd geographical arrangement, there were bound to be differences. So yes, do share that story now that I've provided some context.
So I understand that, the Occupy in Zuccotti Park in particular drew a lot of people to it who were just there. I mean, they weren't there in some professional category. They're just there. And there was a dispute between the drummers and other people who were, on the, what was the governing body? There's actually a governing body. What's it called?
It's called the General Assembly.
The General Assembly. Okay, so there was a dispute between the drummers and the General Assembly. And there were some young women there who were mediators. And they were listening to an argument going on, and they offered to lend their services to mediate. And the issue finally, at the end of all of the talking about how the drummers disturbed other people, and they shouldn't be able to just drum anytime they felt like it, was having very little success. They were having very little success just brainstorming ways to solve what seemed to be a problem to everyone but the drummers. And in the second day of the mediation, the mediators said that they gave up. and that they didn't think that they could help the drummers and the General Assembly come to an agreement. But many proposed solutions had been suggested. And the real problem the drummers were having is that they contested the right of did you say the General Assembly?
That's correct.
Okay. They contested the right of the General Assembly to tell them what to do. And as soon as everybody shrugged their shoulders and gave up, the drummers said, well, what if we do this? And then they offered a solution that had been floated hours before, maybe even the next day, and it was resolved. So the issue that was involved was the right to self-determination, and the complaint was somebody is trying to exercise authority over us, and we don't believe that's a legitimate exercise of authority. And when they were freed to make an autonomous decision, they acted like good neighbors, right?
That's
they
wonderful.
Just didn't want to be told what to do.
Boy, that leads to my next question in a way of being able to complete our interview in 15 minutes of fact today, and that deals with the fact that a lot of people, well, I'll say people who are aware of mediation as a career, have wondered whether or not there is a place for them to be able to stand in the middle, much as you do, and either direct traffic or learn how to step back and let people do what they need to do. But you wrote a book called Success as a Mediator for Dummies.
Right.
Now, I'm assuming that someone who would want to be successful as a mediator would want to get this book. So why don't you give us an idea, what is the book about, and why did you put it out there for people to read?
Let me start with why I wrote it. I wrote it because the people who published the Dummies series asked me if I wanted to write it. And I talked to some people and I thought about it, and here are the problems that I was hoping the book could solve. There are very few best practices in mediation. There are no schooling requirements, which some people think is good and some people think is bad. There are no standards, there's no licensing, and there's a great deal of disagreement about what constitutes mediation at all, let alone effective mediation. I believe that under different circumstances, different styles of mediation work. And I knew it was going to be a challenge to write about all of those mediation styles in the Dummies style, because the Dummies style is directive. And the publisher kept saying, well, you have to say you should do this. And I said, I can't say you should do this. Mediation is an art. One of my primary mentors has said to me when I've asked him for better techniques is to shake his head and look at me and say, Vicky, you are the technique. You are the technique. And the more I get that, the better a mediator I become. But too many people take, unsophisticated people who are engaged in a litigation in a legal system they don't understand and bully them into accepting results they don't want to accept. And I have seen that a lot because I blog about mediation. People write to me about it a lot. It troubles me greatly because it is the opposite of mediation. It's like Bizarro Seinfeld. It is the very opposite of what mediation is supposed to do, which is to empower people to resolve their own disputes in a way that will help them transform their relationship not only to one another, but transform their relationship to conflict itself. So that's why I wrote it. But a third of it is about how to make money as a mediator. And let me just say, especially for those people who think I'm leading young people astray by even giving airtime to the possibility that someone go to law school, you cannot make money as a mediator.
Yeah, I grant you that from the experience that I've had in going to mediation groups. Perhaps you can make money by working for the state or county or city as a mediator. There's no doubt that there are positions, there are staff positions that are available. But to hang out a shingle and say, like Lucy, I'm a psychiatrist or I'm a mediator, doesn't exactly ensure a very decent income, does it?
No, there's much more money in war than there is in peace.
Well, is that an argument for buying your book or not, Vicki?
Yes, because 2/3 of the book is about how to negotiate your own problems. I think that the law is for people who cannot handle their own problems. And sometimes the country needs that help. It needs that help so that we can stop bullying and depriving our LGBT brothers and sisters of their rights. And the majority of the people in the country are not quite ready to do that. And so it's a good thing for lawyers to be pressing the issue because, whatever you think of lawyers, they are steeped in the principle that the Bill of Rights is a corrective to democratic rule.
Got it.
So,
well, Victoria, also known as Vicki, I want to know how much I appreciate you spending some time with us today. I have a feeling this will probably be the first of a number of interviews we might have over time. But I want the listener to know that you can find Vicki by way of email at victoria.pynchon, that's spelled Pynchon, @gmail.com, on LinkedIn as Victoria Pynchon, on Facebook as Victoria Pynchon, on Twitter, however, as Vicki, Vickie Pynchon, and at her own website, victoriapynchon.com. So, Vicki, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you. It was really a whole lot of fun.
Well, this is Jerry Ashton of 15 Minutes of Fact here on WGRNradio.com, having more fun than I deserve. I want to thank the listener for stopping by to learn more about the Occupy movement and from those who have something of value to say about it. Signing off, Jerry Ashton.